Welcome back, everybody. In this section, we talk about Earth's water. So we talked about these different containers or reservoirs that water can take on Earth. But how much water is in each one of those containers? So we're asking the question, where is most of Earth's water? And you might consider pausing here, take a moment, try to think about where it would be, right? First, second, third on the list, where is most of the water on Earth? What form does it take? I would think that everyone watching this said immediately the oceans. That's going to be where most of the water is. Maybe you didn't know that it was so overwhelming. 97% of the water on Earth is in the oceans. For our purposes, though, because the oceans are sort of one body, we're going to spend time looking here at the fresh water and the other saline waters on Earth. So we ask the question now, what form does most fresh water take? Is it going to be lakes, rivers, glaciers, groundwater? What do you think? Okay, so where are all the places that fresh water can be on Earth? We have things like rivers, lakes, and streams, and glaciers, and groundwater. How is this distributed? Well, let's take a look. So, as it would turn out, most all of this tiny percentage of fresh water that we have of all the available water is tied up in glaciers. It's going to be most of it, about 70%. About 30% is going to be in the form of groundwater. It might be available, most of it is not available or economic for human consumption, and then only a tiny fraction of this tiny fraction is actually going to be our surface water, rivers, lakes, and streams. However, as we'll see, it is this water that is the most important when it comes to shaping the continents and shaping the surface of the Earth. So of this tiny fraction here, what percentage do you think is tied up in lakes or streams? How much is in rivers? How much is in human man-made reservoirs, and how much is going to be in different living organisms? What do you think is the breakdown percentage-wise of all those elements? Let's go ahead and take a look. Well, as it turns out, just like most of the fresh water is tied up in glaciers and ice caps, most of the surface water and other fresh water is going to be tied up in ground ice and permafrost, or permanently frozen ground. Now, about a fifth of it, 20% or so, is going to be tied up in lakes, and then of this remaining 10%, about a third is in the atmosphere as water vapor, about a third is in moisture in the soil as loose particles, not as any sort of a collected groundwater reservoir. About a third is in swamps and marshes, and then a tiny fraction, less than 1%, is going to be in living things and in rivers. But it is actually this tiny fraction which turns out to be the most important. So to help us wrap our heads around this, we're going to use an analogy here. You imagine that all the water on Earth, all of it, were put into 100 1-liter water bottles. Well, right off the bat, almost 98 of those water bottles are going to be completely unusable, going to be salt water, you can't drink it. Of the remaining 2.5 water bottles, almost 2 of them would be frozen solid. So it's going to be glaciers, ice caps, waters that are not usable to human beings. You're going to have almost 1 water bottle which consists of groundwater, some of which is going to be usable and some of which is not. And it would only be 0.03 liters, about a sip of water in one of these, 6 teaspoons worth of water, that is actually usable, fresh surface water available to human beings. I've put it all together here on this slide. Most of Earth's water is salt water. The tiny fraction of it that is fresh water, most of that is frozen. A lot of it is groundwater, much of which is inaccessible to human beings. You have a tiny fraction of the tiny fraction of fresh water that is surface water, lakes, and rivers, and of that, most of it is going to be permafrost, and a tiny percentage of that is going to be in usable form or in the atmosphere or in living things. The point, a small percentage of Earth's water, about 0.3%, is even in any way usable to plants or animals. This is mostly coming from surface water and a little bit from groundwater. In the next section, we're going to dig into that tiny fraction that is the surface water, the part that is the most important factor when it comes to shaping Earth's surface and deciding what the surface of the Earth looks like.